Did you know that the objects that I'm holding in my hands could make me rich? Well, you probably know about the lottery ticket, but the lab book? Why is it so valuable? Now, the lab book is valuable because it holds new ideas and procedures. Now, we all know that new ideas can be valuable. They can base new inventions that can be the subjects for patents, and patents can be worth millions of dollars. But those ideas are only worthwhile if they've been properly documented. And that's why the laboratory notebook becomes so important. In some laboratories, particularly basic science laboratories, the lab notebook is typically the primary document that is used to keep records of things that happen. However, the poor laboratory notebook gets a lot less attention than it deserves. In many labs, the laboratory notebook becomes a disorganized collection of jottings and personal annotations that certainly bears no resemblance to an organized record. It becomes a kind of a personal diary for the person who is writing in it. But this kind of a practice is dangerous. The laboratory notebook will be the document that is pulled if there is ever any question of ownership of intellectual property. In a medical products environment, in a company, the laboratory notebook is especially important because many of its results may base the development of products that will be used in humans later. Let's think of a situation where you put together a new chemical compound. Now, you don't think much of it at the time, but you note the results in your laboratory notebook. Now, let's look later, several years later, and you find that that compound is now worth millions of dollars. But you have a competitor, and that competitor says that you didn't invent that drug first, I did. So the laboratory notebook is going to be the key piece of data that is used when people try to understand who was the first inventor. And remember, in the US, in patent law, the first to invent is the person who is eventually going to be the owner of the patent. So now let's look at your laboratory notebook in this new light. When your laboratory notebook is inspected by others, all the world gets to see poor documentation habits. Your laboratory notebook instead should be organized in a way that identifies clearly when you invent something, when you do something. Subsequent entries should be made in such a way that there is no way that fraud could have occurred. You have to be able to show that you didn't go back and change those results. And finally, you have to have this laboratory notebook in such a way that it doesn't get lost or stolen by others. So what we're going to do in this video is review all of these kinds of issues and try to help you understand good laboratory notebook practices. Hopefully, these will help to bring consistency to the way that you and your colleagues manage your laboratory notebooks. Let us look first at your choice of laboratory notebook. Now, here I have a very nice notebook. It's a loose leaf binder, seems sensible, can take pages in, pages out, very convenient. Now, this is not a good idea because I can take pages in and I can take pages out. It's very difficult to control a loose leaf binder like this. Typically, what you want instead is a hardbound kind of book, or at least a book that has pages that cannot come out, and preferably pages that are consecutively numbered. Now, typically, if you work for a large organization, you will be issued a laboratory notebook that's standardized for the company. That laboratory notebook will probably bear a number, and it will be assigned to you. It will be your responsibility. So now you have this nice clean book. What do you do now? You will want to set it up so that you have your personal information at the beginning of the book, and that way you can find this information If for any reason the book is lost, it can come back to you. Now, usually we reserve the first 2 pages of the book for a table of contents. That way you can keep track of some of the important different stages of operation that are recorded in your notebook. So now I've set up my laboratory notebook in a way that would make my grade 10 teacher proud. I'm about to make my first entry. Remember, this has to be a permanent record, so I'm going to make those entries in permanent ink, preferably black ink, and not use pencil in my book. If I used pencil, of course, I could easily erase that annotation. Now, sometimes I have to put things in my book that are not simply easy to write in. I'm going to want to attach records, for example, and I do this in a special way. I tape around all the edges of the attachment, and then I sign across the tape. That way, if anyone removes that piece of paper at a later date, it'll be clear that something has been removed. I try to make entries fairly carefully, but everybody makes mistakes now and then. How do I correct a mistake? Typically, the way to do it is to draw a single line through the error and then initial and date the corrected annotation. If you put a little note about why you corrected the annotation, that's all to the good. If you make a mistake on a whole page, again, you can draw a line through the whole page and initial and date that line. If for any reason you have to leave a blank page, put a line through that page and initial and date that line too. There should be no empty spaces left in your laboratory notebook in case you're tempted later to fill those in. The content of your laboratory notebook is important as well. It's important that you try to write down as much as you can in the laboratory notebook, even if you are in a hurry. In addition, your content needs to be as organized as you can. That having been said, a laboratory notebook that is too very organized could be suspicious. We all know that laboratory notebooks are used during experiments, and so that a certain level of sloppiness and problem entries are to be expected. The important thing is that you do the best you can to keep your notebook as up-to-date and thorough as possible. Don't be afraid of it. Don't stop writing in it for fear that you will do a bad job. A few other notes about content. What you do want to put in your laboratory notebook is anything that you will need to know in order to reproduce the experiment you're describing. Thus, if you use any special reagents, any monoclonal antibodies, you will want to list their source or their batch lot here. It may be important later. There are things too that shouldn't go in a laboratory notebook. For example, you shouldn't write personal comments or describe your date here. This is not a place where you identify that your boss is a jerk. This can have serious negative implications if it goes into court, both for your credibility and for that of your boss. If you're working in an industrial environment, for example, you might be working for a contract research organization or a pharmaceutical company, the documentation that you put in your lab book can assume even greater importance. The information may be used as a base for studies in humans or for identifying the safety or efficacy of medical products. In these cases, you are not just a research scientist anymore. You are a guardian of fairly important data that will be scrutinized carefully when these products are approved. You must be especially careful to ensure that this data is kept confidential and that may require that you keep the lab notebooks in which you write in a secure location when they're not in use. Your laboratory notebook is an important part of assuring the quality and integrity of your data. You're responsible for the disciplined management of this book. If you don't have enough information about how to manage your laboratory notebook, I'd encourage you to seek it out as quickly as possible from your superiors or your colleagues. If your company doesn't have procedures about laboratory notebooks, it's probably important that you help them to put such procedures in place. This will greatly strengthen your reputation, your work, and your intellectual property. I am calling the laboratory notebook a legal document. How does that work? Well, let's imagine that you've discovered a new chemical entity. You don't think much of it at the time, but you write it down in your laboratory notebook. Now, flash forward to several years later, and that discovery is worth several $1 million. But wait, your competitor says that they had the idea first. Your laboratory notebook will be the key piece of evidence that's used in a court of law to establish inventorship. Remember that in the USA, it's the person who is first to invent who is given the patent rights. The laboratory notebook is used to prove both invention and reduction to practice. So first it needs to show exactly when the idea occurred. Then it has to show all the efforts that were made to provide a working model or some other form of active invention. And it must do this in a way that makes it clear that no fraud or change in the data has occurred during the process. If two labs are competing for the same intellectual property, it's likely that the patent rights will go to the company that has the best control of the invention date and the process of reduction to practice, all other things being equal. The most beautifully prepared notebook of the world still needs to be subject to another step. It needs to be in some way date stamped to ensure the credibility of the entries. Now, this is usually done by having a protocol by which you have a second person who signs off on that data set. Now, the person that you choose to sign off your notebook should not just be the man on the street. You should choose somebody who can, first of all, understand what you're putting into the notebook so they can make sure it makes sense. You should also make sure that you have a credible person, a person who is also not in a position of conflict of interest. You certainly do not want your notebook signed off by your collaborator, who in the case of a patent dispute would be a co-inventor on the project. What are the important things that you need to put in a laboratory notebook? Well, you do need to put the details of your experiments, but don't forget to put the important ideas, the ideas that drove you to make the decisions about those details. And in addition, make sure that you put in as many steps as possible so that you can clearly identify reduction to practice. That way, if you find yourself in a patent litigation, that kind of information will be crucially important to the work that you do. So you've filled your notebook and now it's time to move on. What are you going to do with that notebook? Well, it's important that often that these notebooks be kept as permanent records. They are often archived. If they're used for the development of medical products, they may be archived for as much as 20 years. So it's important for you to recognize that this is not your book. This is not your personal diary. It belongs to the company, and the company will be responsible for its archiving arrangements. Now, you may decide that you're moving to another place and you'd like access to the data that's in your notebook. In this case, you must ask the permission of the company to whom the notebook belongs. If they give permission, then you can copy that material and take the copies with you, leaving the original in the hands of the owner. They will also be subject to scrutiny if there are any research irregularities in your laboratory. You might ask, what would such auditors look for? Well, typically, if your laboratory notebook is totally disorganized and messy, that will have serious implications for the credibility of your data. On the other hand, if your laboratory notebook looks just too good to be true, that can also raise significant red flags with the auditors. So the best thing is just to work as diligently as possible to keep your laboratory notebook as organized as possible, accepting the fact that mistakes will happen. The main thing is that you use discipline to correct those mistakes and ensure that, to the greatest extent possible, you understand the importance of the work that you are documenting. At a minimum, you should try to make sure that your entries are legible and that you provide enough information that somebody who knows similar kinds of approaches could reproduce your data.